She was 21 years old, standing on a mud-slicked road in November, with $9 folded inside her boot and a dead man's tin shears tucked in her bag, and she had nowhere left to go. We want you to hold that image for a moment. A young woman alone on a dirt track through the gray maritime hills of Nova Scotia, the wind off the bay cutting through her wool coat like it had a point to prove. $9, a pair of shears, and behind her, a locked door that would not open again. That is where Rowena Fisk's story begins. Not with a plan, not with a triumph, but with a locked door and a muddy road and a cold that had nowhere to hide from. Rowena had been born in the town of Cove Harbor in the spring of 1874, the daughter of a fisherman named Warren Fisk and a schoolteacher named Dinah Fisk, née Coombs. She was 7 years old when her father's dory failed to come back from the mackerel grounds in August, and 9 when her mother followed him. Not to the sea, but to a quick and merciless fever that took 3 others on their street in the same fortnight. After that, Rowena went to live with her father's brother, her uncle Aldred Fisk, and his wife, Georgina. Aldred was not a cruel man, not exactly. He worked at the county land office and came home each evening smelling of ink and pipe tobacco, and he fed Rowena and gave her a bed and asked nothing more of her than that she not be too much trouble. Georgina, however, was a woman who kept a careful mental ledger of every kindness she had ever extended, and she reviewed it nightly. She had 3 children of her own, and she looked at Rowena the way a shopkeeper looks at stock that doesn't move, not with hostility, but with a mild and permanent impatience. For 12 years, Rowena lived in that careful, airless space between being tolerated and being wanted. She learned to keep herself quiet. She learned to be useful. She swept and cooked and mended without being asked, because she understood, even as a child, that she was living on the goodwill of someone else's arithmetic. What saved her, what truly saved her, was the workshop next door. Henry Brack had been a tinsmith in Cove Harbor for 40 years. He was a widower somewhere in his mid-70s, with hands spotted and darkened from decades of flux and solder, and a way of moving through his shop that was unhurried and entirely certain. He made everything from milk pans to lanterns, to the copper weather vanes that sat on half the barns in the county. His wife had died young, his one son had gone west, and written less and less with every passing year, and Henry Brack had settled into a solitary industry that suited him down to the bone. He noticed Rowena the way he noticed everything, quietly and with patience. She had been peering through the open side door of his workshop for nearly a week before he set a scrap of sheet tin and a small pair of snips on the bench nearest the door and went back to what he was doing. She stood outside for a long time before she stepped in. That was the beginning of it. Henry Brack did not teach the way teachers teach. He did not lecture or explain in long sentences. He demonstrated, and he waited, and when Rowena made a mistake, and she made many, he showed her what had gone wrong without making her feel foolish for having done it. He taught her how to score a cut line with a scribe, how to feel the tension in a sheet of tin as you bent it over the break, how to tell from the color of a soldering iron whether it was hot enough or not. He showed her how to cut patterns for a conical lantern so it would shed water rather than collect it, and how to peen the seam of a copper pan so it held without any gap at all. He taught her the names of tools she'd never heard of and the properties of metals she'd never thought about, and he did all of it in the same slow, certain way, without impatience and without fanfare. In the summer she turned 15, he let her make a lantern from start to finish, entirely on her own. When she was done, he held it up to the light from the doorway, turned it once in his hands, set it down, and said, "That'll do." From Henry Brack, that was everything. For her 17th birthday, he gave her a pair of folding tin shears he had made himself. The handles wrapped in leather he'd stitched by hand, the blades ground to a keenness that could part a sheet of tin clean as cloth. A proper tool, he said, for a proper tinsmith. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said everything, but she understood what he meant. He had looked at her and seen a tinsmith, not a charity case, not an inconvenience, a tinsmith. Henry Brack died in the spring of her 18th year, quietly in his sleep, the way she hoped she would go someday. He left the shears to her in his will, along with his soldering iron and a collection of his own pattern templates. She kept all of it the way other people keep photographs. Life in Aldred and Georgina's house continued as it had until it didn't. That autumn, Aldred Fisk had a heart attack at his desk at the county land office and was gone before they could send for the doctor. Georgina's grief was genuine, Rowena believed, but grief in Georgina's hands quickly arranged itself into practicality. Within the week, She had sat Rowena down at the kitchen table and explained, with no particular unkindness and no particular warmth, that the house would go to her children. Rowena was a grown woman now. It was time she made her own arrangements. Rowena did not argue. She packed her canvas satchel, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's prayer book, Henry's shears and soldering iron and templates, and she tucked her $9 into her boot. She left on a Tuesday morning in November 1895. Georgina held the door open for her. She was not unkind about it. That almost made it worse. The road west out of Cove Harbor unspooled through country Rowena knew, and then through country she didn't. She walked for 3 days, sleeping 2 nights in farm haylofts in exchange for mending work. The sky was low and spat sleet, and the maples had long since gone bare. She was not afraid exactly. She had been living with a low, constant anxiety for 12 years, and in its own strange way, walking alone in the cold was simpler than sitting in Georgina's kitchen and calculating how to be invisible enough. At least out here, no one was counting what she cost. She had heard from a post rider who stopped at one of the farms where she'd sheltered about the Harrow River Valley, a narrow forested valley running inland from the bay, known for good water, and a scatter of farms built around an old mill site. Remote. Land was cheap there, the rider said. Not much, but what was there was solid. She turned south and walked toward it. The settlement at the mouth of the Harrow Valley was not so much a town as a gathering of intentions. There was a general store that also served as the post office and the de facto land office, run by a man named Lachlan Quill, a rail-thin Scotsman with enormous sideburns and a habit of asking questions in the form of statements. There was a blacksmith's forge, a small white church with a listing steeple, and perhaps 8 houses strung along the river road. Rowena pushed open the door of Quill's store and stood for a moment in the smell of dried beans and tobacco and coal oil. Warmth. She had almost forgotten what that felt like. Lachlan Quill looked at her over the counter. "Come a long way," he said. It was not a question. "I'm looking for land," Rowena told him. "Something with a structure on it, if there is one. I have $9. He studied her with the expression of a man deciding how much patience to invest in a situation. Then he went to the back shelf and lifted out a ledger, heavy and water-stained. He opened it on the counter. "One property on the books," he said. "The Pelham Mill. South bank of the Harrow, about 1.5 miles up from here. Stone mill house, wheel and race, 5 acres with the water rights. Been sitting empty 12 years. He paused. "County wants $9 to clear the deed." Rowena did not move. "Why has it been empty 12 years? Lachlan Quill set down his pen. He was quiet for a moment, the way people get quiet when they're deciding how honest to be. "Gordon and Iris Pelham built the mill," he said. "Good people. Hard workers. They had a daughter, June. She was 8 years old." He stopped. "She drowned in the mill race. Spring runoff, the sluice gate failed. Gordon blamed himself, though everyone else said it wasn't his fault. He couldn't work the mill after that. Died about 2 years later. Just stopped, mostly. Iris stayed on alone for another 3 years. Then one morning she was gone. Left everything behind. No one's heard from her since." He folded his hands on the counter. "2 families tried to take the property after. Neither one stayed past a season. People here call it the Pelham grief." Rowena stood very still, thinking about grief and what it does to places. She thought about Henry Brack's workshop after he died. How it had felt charged and silent at the same time, full of the shape of someone who was no longer there. She thought that a place could hold grief the way cast iron holds heat, long after the fire was out. "I'll take it," she said. She pulled off her boot and counted $9 onto the counter. Lachlan Quill looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. The path to the Pelham Mill followed the river, and the sound of the water was a constant, cold presence at Rowena's left shoulder as she walked. She heard the mill before she saw it, a low, intermittent creak from the half-rotted wheel that the current still caught now and then, turning at a quarter revolution and letting it drop back. Then the trees opened, and she saw it. The mill sat on a stone-faced embankment above the race, a 2-story timber frame structure, with a stone foundation and a low mill house attached to the south side where the family had lived. The water wheel was in poor shape, several paddles missing, the axle housing visibly cracked. But the stone mill race itself was intact and well built, the mortar still tight. The roof of the mill house had sagged in one corner but held. The heavy oak door was off its lower hinge, leaning at an angle. Other people might have seen ruin. Rowena Fisk saw a roof that could be straightened, a wheel that could be rebuilt, stone walls that had stood 30 years and would stand 30 more. She heard Henry Brack's voice in her memory, as clear as she had ever heard it. Look at the bones of a thing before you look at the flesh. Bones tell you what it's worth. The bones here were good. She walked to the door, lifted it back onto its lower hinge with her shoulder, and pushed it open. Inside the mill house was a single room with a sleeping loft above, plank floors dark with age, a stone hearth along the back wall, a window with one shutter gone. The smell was of river damp and old wood ash, and the particular mineral cold of a place that had not been warm in a very long time. A tin cup still sat on the sill of the remaining shutter. She picked it up. Good work, rolled rim, no seam gap. Whoever had made this had known what they were doing. We will tell you that the weeks that followed were the hardest of Rowena's life, and also, in some strange way, the most purely herself she had ever been. She started with the roof, the sagging corner over the loft. She used Henry's shears to cut tin flashings from salvaged sheet metal she found in the mill's storage room, and she worked her way along the worst of the gaps, fitting and folding and peening each piece into place. The rhythm of the work was familiar and steadying. She had learned from Henry that every repair is a kind of conversation with the person who built the thing originally. You look at how they solved a problem, and you either follow their lead or you find a better way. Gordon Pelham, she decided within the first week, had been a careful builder. His stonework was tight. His timber joints were cut with a precision she recognized as pride, not just competence. She was working alongside a man she had never met, and she was beginning to understand him. She repaired the door with a new iron hinge she traded mending work for at the blacksmith's. She sealed the gaps in the wall, chinking with a clay and sand mixture she worked by the river. She fabricated a new lantern for the window from a piece of tin she found in the mill store. Not because she had to, but because the light mattered, and because making light was what she knew how to give. She worked from first light until she could no longer see. She was cold most of the time. She was also, for the first time in her memory, entirely free of the sensation of being in someone else's way. It was in her third week that she found it. One of the planks near the hearth had warped badly, lifted at one end, so that it caught her boot each time she crossed the room. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, with sleet ticking against the remaining shutter, she finally livered it up with the pry bar she had borrowed from the blacksmith. Beneath the plank, between two of the foundation stones, there was a gap, and in the gap, wrapped in a square of oilcloth and tied with braided twine, was a tin box. Rowena knelt there a moment, with the box in her hands. It was her own trade. She knew good work when she held it. The box was well made, the seams double-folded and tight, the lid fitted close, sealed at the edge with a bead of candle wax that had darkened with age but held. Whoever had made this had wanted it to last. She carried it to the doorway light. She used her awl to break the wax seal, and she opened the lid. Inside lay three things. The first was a small watercolor painting on a rectangle of pasteboard, a little girl with dark braids and a blue pinafore, standing on a riverbank with her hands at her sides, looking at something beyond the edge of the frame. The brushwork was careful and loving, the kind of painting made by someone who needed the image to exist in the world, who could not let it exist only in memory. The second was a small carved wooden bird, a robin, the red of its breast still faintly visible, though the paint had mostly worn away. It was the size of Rowena's thumb. It had been handled so much that its edges were smooth and almost soft. The third was a folded letter, the paper yellowed but the ink still clear, written in a deliberate, steady hand. She sat down on the threshold of the mill, the box across her knees, the river sound filling the cold air around her, and she read. To whoever opens this, my name is Iris Pelham. My husband Gordon and I came to the Harrow Valley in 1879 with our daughter June, who was then 5 years old. Gordon built this mill over 3 summers, stone by stone, timber by timber. June said her favorite sound in the world was the wheel when the water ran high in spring. She would stand at the sluice gate and count the turns. In the spring of 1887, the gate failed during the freshet. June was playing near the race. I will not write more than that. Gordon did not recover. He worked one more season, and then he simply could not anymore. He died in the autumn of 1889. I stayed on. I do not know exactly why, perhaps because leaving felt like leaving them both. But there is a kind of grief that wears you down the way water wears stone, slowly and without ceasing, and in the end I could not stay either. I am writing this in November of 1890. Tomorrow I am going to my sister in New Brunswick. I do not know if I will come back. What I am leaving in this box, June's robin, She found it on the riverbank the summer she was 6 and carried it in her pocket every single day after that. I cannot take it from this place. It belongs here, near the water. I am also leaving this. Rowena turned the letter over. On the back, Iris Pelham had drawn a careful map, and beneath it in the same steady hand. Gordon filed the mill deed in 1882. He meant to file a second deed for the timber stand on the north slope. 40 acres of good spruce and birch, in June's name, to be hers when she came of age. He never did. The deed is beneath the painting in this box. It has never been registered with the county. By law, if you present it to the recorder in Harrow with this letter, it is yours. I am giving it to you. Whoever you are, whatever brought you to this place, I am giving it to you, because Gordon meant for this land to help someone build a life, and I cannot let it sit in the dark unclaimed forever. Use this mill, grind flour, let there be smoke from this chimney and light in this window. That is all I ask. One more thing, take June's robin down to the river, let it feel the water once. She would have wanted that. May you find in this place more joy than we were able to keep. Iris Pelham, November 14, 1890. Rowena sat for a long time on the threshold of the Pelham mill. The river ran on. The cold sat on her shoulders like a hand. We think you understand. If you have ever held something that belonged to someone who is gone, what Rowena felt in that moment. It is not a comfortable feeling. It is the feeling of being handed something that matters by someone who can no longer hold it themselves. It is a weight and a gift at the same time, and there is no separating one from the other. The mill had never been cursed. She understood that now. It was simply full of a grief so complete it had driven out everyone who came near. But Rowena Fisk had spent her entire life on the edge of other people's losses, and she had learned, first from her father's absence and her mother's early death, and then from 12 years in Georgina's careful, loveless house, that grief was not a reason to leave a place. It was a reason to tend it. She closed her eyes and made a promise to Iris Pelham, and to Gordon, and to a little girl with dark braids, who had loved the sound of the mill wheel in spring. She would make it turn again. The deed, presented to the county recorder in Harrow with Iris Pelham's letter, was valid. The recorder, an older man who had known Gordon Pelham slightly, took off his spectacles and cleaned them twice before he spoke. Well, he said at last, I'll be a son of a gun. He stamped the transfer and handed Rowena her copy. 40 acres of timber on the north slope. It was not a fortune, but it was a foundation that changed everything. She spent part of the timber income on materials. A new axle housing for the wheel, cedar shingles for the roof, lime for a proper mortar repoint on the north wall, and she went to find Erasmus Kite, the name Lackland Quill had given her when she asked who in the valley knew mills. Erasmus Kite was a millwright in his late 60s, with a white beard trimmed close and an unhurried way of considering mechanical problems. The way a person looks at things when they have seen enough bad solutions to know that patience is the cheapest fix. He had known Gordon Pelham. He came the next morning, walked the wheel and the race without speaking for several minutes, then said simply, "We can fix this." Over the following weeks, Erasmus Kite and Rowena Fisk rebuilt the water wheel together. He taught her the mechanics of it, the sweep of the paddles, the pitch that caught the current most efficiently, the way cam and gear translated the wheels, turning into the millstones grinding. She taught him, in return, how to fabricate the new metal components they needed, replacement bushings, iron straps for the wheel frame, a new gate plate for the sluice, working the tin and strap iron with Henry's shears and iron and solder while Erasmus watched. He said, quietly, after a while, "Whoever taught you did a good job." She told him about Henry Brack, and he listened the way the people of this valley seemed to listen, fully, without interruption, with a real and unhurried attention she was not accustomed to. The first time the wheel turned under live water, on a cold Saturday afternoon in early December, they both stepped back and stood in silence. The sound of it filled the valley, the creak and rush, and deep groan of something coming back to life after a long stillness. Rowena felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known she was holding tight. It was not lost on her that this sound was what June Pelham had loved most. The first neighbors to come were a farm family named Vass. A woman of about 40 named Lottie Vass appeared at the mill house door one afternoon with a cast-iron pot of salt cod chowder balanced against her hip. "We heard the wheel," she said, as though that explained everything. And it did, really. The wheel had been silent for 12 years, and now it wasn't, and in a place this small, that meant something. Lottie Vass came back the following week with a dozen eggs and the news that 3 farms needed grain ground before the deep freeze. Within a fortnight, Rowena had work lined up into the new year. Erasmus Kite returned too, ostensibly to check the wheel's rotation under a grinding load. He brought with him a small brass caliber gauge that had belonged to a millwright friend of his, long gone now. No use sitting in a drawer, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. A tool needs to be used. She accepted it with both hands. Even Lachlan Quill thawed in his measured way. When Rowena came into the store to buy a sack of barley for a test grind, he tucked a box of candles into her order without comment. "Winter's long," he said. "Keep the light going." People stopped calling it the Pelham Mill, and they stopped calling it the Cursed Mill. When they needed to give someone directions to the South Bank, they said, "Go up past the Fisk Mill." She had a name for it now, and the name was hers. On the first true day of December, when a skin of new ice had appeared overnight at the river's edges, but the main channel still ran clear and cold, Rowena walked down to the water with June Pelham's carved robin in her hand. She knelt at the bank and held the little bird down in the current, letting the cold river rush over her fingers and over the smooth, worn wood. She held it there for a long moment, long enough for the river to know it, long enough to mean something. Then she lifted it back and dried it carefully on the hem of her coat, and she carried it back up to the mill house. She did not say anything aloud. She didn't need to. The first deep snow of winter came in the second week of December, falling in thick and patient flakes that laid a silence over the Harrow Valley, unlike any silence Rowena had known before. Not the silence of an empty house, not the silence of being ignored, but the full and easy silence of a place at rest. Inside the mill, the fire in the repaired hearth burned steady and sure. The stones radiated a warmth that reached the loft above. Outside, the wheel was still, the river low, resting until spring. Rowena sat on the bench she had built from a split pine log and looked at the two things she had placed on the shelf above the hearth. The first was Henry Brack's tin shears, their leather handles worn dark and smooth with years of use, the blades still true. They were the proof of what she had been taught and the proof of who she was. They were the tool that had brought her here, not literally, but in every way that counted. Without Henry Brack setting a scrap of tin on a workbench and going back to his work, none of the rest of it happened. She knew that. The second was June Pelham's carved robin, its wood clean now from the river, the ghost of the red breast still just visible in the firelight. She sat and looked at both of them for a while. She thought about what Iris Pelham had done, not abandoned the place, she understood now, but entrusted it, left something in the dark and hoped. Hoped that whoever came would be the right person, would have the hands and the patience and the will to make the wheel turn again. That was a kind of courage, Rowena thought, that went mostly unrecognized. The courage of hoping when you had no way of knowing whether your hope would reach anyone at all. She thought about what Henry Brack had done for her all those years ago, setting a scrap of tin on a bench and going back to work. He had not rescued her, he had equipped her. There was a difference, and the difference mattered more than she could say. She thought about Rowena Fisk, who had looked at her for 12 years and never quite managed to see her. She thought about her father under the gray water off Cove Harbor, and her mother who had smelled of chalk dust and hummed while she corrected papers in the evenings. She thought about the strange and unplanned family that was forming itself around her here in the Harrow Valley. Lottie Vass with her cast iron pot, Erasmus Kite with his millwright's patience and his brass gauge, Lachlan Quill with his candles and his grudging warmth. None of them were bound to her by blood. All of them had shown up anyway. The world had sent her out onto a muddy November road with $9 in her boot and a dead man's tools in her bag. And at the end of that road, she had found a broken mill and a tin box and a letter from a woman she would never meet, who had somehow trusted that the right person was coming, even when she had no reason in the world to believe it. Rowena Fisk was 21 years old. She had spent everything she had on a mill. The whole valley said was haunted by grief. It was the best $9 she had ever spent. Here at Cabin Stories, we believe there is a kind of quiet courage that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't look like courage from the outside, but is simply the steady refusal to stop. Rowena didn't fight anyone. She didn't reclaim anything that was taken from her. She showed up at a broken mill with the tools she had, and she began the work that was in front of her. And in doing so, she kept a promise made by a woman she had never met, to a little girl the river had taken too soon. She made the wheel turn. She let there be light in the window. That was enough. That was everything. Before we leave you tonight, we want to ask you something, and we mean it sincerely. Is there a place you know, or a person, that the world gave up on too easily? Something left behind that turned out to hold more than anyone expected? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and your stories matter to us. And if Rowena's stayed with you, we hope you'll come back for the next one.